the case that China is trying to make is fairly weak. And I think the real thing that should be emphasized is that the Taiwanese people really don't want to become part of the PRC.
According to Chinese state media, President Xi Jinping declared in his New Year address that people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait share a bond of blood and kinship, insisting that what he calls the reunification of the motherland is unstoppable. But Xi's claims over Taiwan don't stand up to the historical record or to public opinion on the island itself. While many Taiwanese have Chinese heritage, repeated surveys show that more than 2/3 of adults identify as Taiwanese, with fewer than 3% identifying as Chinese. History tells a different story too. Taiwan has never been unified with the People's Republic of China and was in fact ceded to Japan in perpetuity by the Qing dynasty in the late 1800s. Taiwan's past is just one of the subjects explored in a new book, China's Backstory, The History Beijing Doesn't Want You to Read. And in this episode, we're joined by the author, Dr. Lee Moore, to uncover what that history really reveals. Hello and welcome to Perspectives with Neilo, where we go beyond the headlines to examine how history, foreign influence and competing narratives shape modern democracies. I'm your host, Neil O'Sullivan. If this is your first time joining us on the podcast, we have over 80 past episodes. Recently, we covered such topics as China's mega embassy in London, how China's influence in Ireland has shaped government behaviour over the past 4 decades, as well as the plight of the Uyghur people, and much more. You can find all of our past episodes by searching for Perspectives with Neilo on your favourite podcast app or on our blog site at pwneilo.com. That's pwneilo.com. And while you're there, we'd really appreciate your support. With so many podcasts available nowadays, it can be tough for smaller shows to break through. Hitting that subscribe or follow button goes a long way in helping us grow, and we truly appreciate it. In this episode of Perspectives with Neilo, I'm delighted to chat with Dr. Lee Moore, who is the author of the book China's Backstory, The History Beijing Doesn't Want You to Read. Lee received his PhD from the University of Oregon, where he previously worked as an adjunct professor teaching Chinese and Taiwanese literature and film. He's the founder of the Chinese Literature Podcast, and he occasionally writes for publications such as The Economist, the China Books Review, and the China Project. All right, so Lee Moore, you're very welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Neil.
So your new book is called China's Backstory, The History Beijing Doesn't Want You to Read. Can you give us a brief overview of what it's all about?
Sure. So it's about the 4 China-related news topics that are popping up in the news feeds of Westerners. That's Taiwan, Xinjiang, the Chinese economy, and Hong Kong. And I tried to write the book in a way that it wasn't written for an academic audience at all. It was written, it's backed up by scholarship. The footnotes are an enormous part of the book. But I do things where I'm trying to speak to normal people, not people in the academy.
Okay, and when I was doing some research for our interview, I noticed that the famous sinologist, Professor Perry Link, wrote a really nice endorsement to your book. And coincidentally, one of our recent podcast episodes referred to a famous phrase of his, the anaconda in the chandelier. Can you tell us briefly what Perry Link said about the book?
So Professor Link said in 2013, Xi Jinping called for, quote, telling China's story well. By, quote, telling well, he meant recycling CCP fables so that they slide down gullets like honey. In China's Backstory, Lee Moore flatly disobeys, not by telling smooth stories of his own, but by offering fact-studded chapters on Taiwan, Xinjiang, China's economy, and Hong Kong, 4 topics on which the CCP most craves sleek deceptions. No fables of any kind can survive all the boulders and pebbles of Moore's radical empiricism. Don't be put off that the author uses words like pissed and we'll just bleep that other one. He is objecting with reason, in my view, to the pretentious jargon that pervades academe, but then just carries it a bit too far. Read him for his meticulous history and fine literary comment, too. So I just reached out to Professor Link. I didn't know him. He and I had not conversed before. I've watched his work. I read his work. He did. He edited the Tiananmen Papers when a Chinese government official smuggled them out of China, and I've admired his work. And I just emailed him. I happened to have his email, and he had no obligation to me at all. And he was still kind enough to read the book and kind enough to give me that endorsement, which I'm really proud of.
Oh, that's wonderful. Because I find his like turn of phrase really just interesting. Particularly there, like he said, these topics which the CCP craves most sleek deceptions. And of course, one of those is Taiwan. One of those topics in your book as well is Taiwan. And most listeners will be aware we cover Taiwan quite a lot on this podcast, and that China or the PRC claims Taiwan as part of their territory. In fact, the CCP frequently says Taiwan has been part of China since ancient times. So it made me smile when I read in your book that the first incontrovertible historical record of someone landing on the island of Taiwan wasn't even written by a Chinese. Can you tell us about those first written records of Taiwan?
The first records we have of Taiwan are actually Portuguese sailors. I think the years are 1544. The Portuguese sailed past Taiwan and record it as Ilha Formosa, or the beautiful island. And then in 1588, I believe, and my dates might be a little bit off, but 1588, Portuguese sailors shipwreck on Taiwan, and that's the first time we have a written record of people who we know went to Taiwan. The first Chinese record that we are certain is a record of a Chinese person going to Taiwan is actually 1603. It's a guy named Chen Di. He's a bureaucrat who goes with an admiral to actually smite some pirates that are using Taiwan as a home base, a place to hide away so that they can harass shipping on the South China coast. Before that, the stuff that we have that is Chinese text that the Chinese government oftentimes points to as records of Chinese people going to Taiwan is just so unclear that it's hard to know whether or not they're actually talking about Taiwan in these texts. So there's I think it's 1348 record of Wang Dayuan who goes to this island that's called Liuqiu. Liuqiu is interesting because the word is just the Chinese form of the word Ryokyu, which in Japanese, refers today to Okinawa and the archipelago around Okinawa. So we have the Ryokyu archipelago that's now technically Japanese territory today. So when Chinese writers in the 1300s are using these terms, they oftentimes are using terms that we're not actually sure where they actually went. Did they go to Okinawa? Did they go to Taiwan? Did they go to the Philippines? We don't really know. And the texts are so vague in terms of their geographic description that it's just hard to pin down. There almost certainly were Chinese folks who did go to Taiwan, who did step foot on Taiwan before 1603. Sailors from Fujian, which is on the southeast China coast, really good sailors. They're right across the water from Taiwan. They're going past Taiwan on their way to Japan and other places. They certainly saw Taiwan, but we just don't have written records where we can be sure. Yes, this person definitely went to Taiwan. Another thing, sometimes you'll see older texts refer to a place called Izhou. This may be Taiwan. It's hard to say. Again, same kind of thing. But it's crazy for Beijing to argue that Izhou refers to a place that is part of China, because Izhou literally means something like barbarian continent, barbarian land. So when Chinese writers are writing about Izhou, whether or not it was actually Taiwan or some other place, it's clearly not Chinese, at least in the eyes of these writers. So it's really kind of crazy, some of the claims Beijing makes. The
Okay. Yeah, sorry to cut in. You mentioned there that it wasn't until the 17th century that Taiwan first appeared on Chinese maps. And one of the characters you spoke about in your book that's quite interesting was this guy, Yan Siqi, or I think the Spaniards called him Pedro Chino. Can you tell us a little bit about him? Who was he? and what was his connection with Taiwan?
So Pedro Chino lived roughly from 1585 to 1625. He is a Chinese guy who has connections. He's probably born, I think, in Fujian, but he lived some period of his life in Japan. He's one of the pirates who Chen Di in 1603 was going to smite, going to try and kill, who were harassing Chinese shipping on the South China coast from their base in Taiwan. He's probably the first Chinese person to set up a colony in Taiwan. In 1959, the ROC, the government that is today, we colloquially refer to it as Taiwan, but it's actually the Republic of China even today. In 1959, the government actually set up a obelisk in Beijing, a little city kind of in central Taiwan, saying this is the place where he first landed and set up the first Chinese colony in Taiwan. So, this guy, we don't know when he did it, but probably sometime in the 1610s, 1620s, he sets up this colony in this small river port in Taiwan. And that's probably, as best as we can tell, the first village established by Chinese folks on Taiwan. Before that, we just don't have that much of a record of Taiwanese people or Chinese people going to Taiwan.
And he's known as the king who opened up Taiwan. Is that correct?
Yeah, something like that. Kaiko Taiwan. Yeah.
And I think you also said in the book, which is quite interesting and a little contradictory of the Chinese Communist Party position on, I guess, controlling the island for more than a millennia, that communists in southern China have also built a museum, I think, some decades ago, honoring him as well.
Yeah, as best I can tell, and just I've seen photographs of a museum that I believe is based in Fujian, where Yan Siqi is from. They have a museum honoring him as this pioneer who goes to Taiwan and opens it up, which is strange if they say that, Chinese people had been there for 1,000 years before Yan Siqi was born. Why are they honoring him for being this pioneering figure opening up Taiwan? I don't get it. But yeah, it's a bit of a contradiction.
And of course, for explorers back in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, I mean, Taiwan would have been a difficult place to land or capture because of ocean currents and geography and so on. But I believe the natives back then also had a reputation. And so
Yeah.
they were feared quite a bit. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Taiwan is the home to the Austronesian language speakers. Austronesians, it's one of the largest language groups. It goes from Hawaii and New Zealand all the way to Madagascar. Those are all they're Austronesian languages all throughout there. So all of these people, an important part of their culture is headhunting. It's something that's evident in every era in Taiwanese archaeology. You have lots of people missing heads in archaeological digs, and one of the reasons that Taiwan seems to have been avoided, as best we can tell, by Chinese folks is because they knew that they would probably get killed, and they would probably lose their head. These stories probably made their way to Chinese sailors, which is one of the reasons why, even though Taiwan and China are so close, just in terms of distance, they are not really connected until about the 1500s or the 1600s, when we start getting records of Chinese folks landing on that island. And it makes sense. I would avoid an island that doesn't appear to have too many trade opportunities and is one where the locals are clearly very aggressive and will cut off heads. This is something that a lot of outsiders, Dutch, Spaniards, Chinese, all recorded about Taiwan.
And this practice of headhunting, actually, it seemed to go on for centuries, right? I think you said in your book that it was early 1900s before the Japanese maybe were the ones that forced them to abandon it. Is that right?
Yeah, the Japanese and I think the 1910s actually pushed most, if not all, indigenous people to abandon this practice. There's a period in the 1930s when a group of indigenous Taiwanese folks massacre some Japanese folks. And the Japanese actually tell some of their enemies, the enemies of the people who massacred the Japanese folks, they say, "Hey, you know what? We said no headhunting, but for these guys, you can go do it." So we have pictures from the 1930s of this headhunting expedition where you'll see 70, 80 heads in the photograph. But that's a fairly isolated incident. For the most part, headhunting is ended by the Japanese in the 1910s.
And prior to the Japanese, I believe it was the Qing dynasty who occupied Taiwan, and they were the first Chinese people to take control of Taiwan for the first time. And that was from 1683 or so. Even though the Qing were Manchu people, maybe I incorrectly called them Chinese. They're strictly Manchu people, right? In other words, they're not Han people. But again, it seems like there were quite a few colorful characters involved in all this history. Could you tell us a little bit about that period when the Qing took control of Taiwan for the first time?
Sure. So before the Qing, so the Dutch colonized the island from 1624 to 1661. There's a kind of fuzzy dates there. And then they're kicked off. There's a group of Ming loyalists. So the Ming falls in 1644, and there are some folks who are still loyal to the Ming. They eventually flee to Taiwan. They are Han Chinese. They take over the island in the 1660s and control the island from 1661 to 1683. They're Han Chinese, but they're not based in China. Once they go to Taiwan, they lose all connections to China, really. The Qing eventually kicks them out in 1683, and you have this period where Qing China, which Qing has this weird kind of state. It is run by the Manchus, but they're vastly outnumbered by their Han Chinese population, and you have a bureaucracy that at the top levels has lots of Manchus, Mongols, all running top levels, top bureaucracies, but most of the bureaucrats are Han Chinese, and I believe most of the bureaucrats involved in running Taiwan, even though it's Qing China, and even though these Manchus are very proud of their accomplishment, a lot of the kind of people on the ground were Han Chinese. You have Qing China. They're trying to figure out what they want to do with this island. In 1683, actually, they conquered the island. They kicked out their enemies. The Zheng regime family had set up on the island. So they kick out the Zhengs, and they're not sure what they want to do with this island. The Emperor Kangxi goes, "I don't even know if I really want to keep this island. Should we just give it up?" So there were questions in 1683 as to whether the Qing were really actually going to even continue owning it. They eventually decide to keep it, but for a while they kind of went back and forth, and you have these massive rebellions because basically the government's not really maintaining much control. So you had in the book I talk about one of the rebellions where you have two dudes from two different Han Chinese ethnic groups or sub-ethnic groups where they're fighting. They meet at a opera, and they are gambling. There's an argument. One of them takes his money out of the place where you put your money when you're gambling, and a fight breaks out. Someone gets their leg cut off, and it just becomes a full-blown rebellion in the middle of the island. These kinds of things happen basically almost once a year. I think it's every 4 years you would have 3 rebellions. So it's very much like the American West about a century later. Taiwan was a place where it was mostly dominated by men, You had the Qing government wasn't allowing women and children to go to the island. The expectation was that you, as a guy, would go over to Taiwan and farm for the summer and then go back to your family in the winter. But, they did the things that young men everywhere do, which is they drank too much, they gambled too much, and they tried to have sex with whoever was willing to have sex with them. And you have a lot of very sordid situations happening, these rebellions that I talked about, but there's also a lot of alcoholism, and there's a lot of prostitution, things like that.
Okay, and you mentioned there about the Qing emperor. I think his name was Kang Shi,
Mhm.
who wasn't sure whether he wanted to take Taiwan or not. I think you said in the book that when he saw it or whatever he heard about it, he said, Taiwan is only a pellet of earth.
Yeah.
He thought it was quite small, which reminded me of Donald Trump, who a few years ago, I think, first time when he saw Taiwan on the map, he couldn't get over how small it was also. So the history does repeat itself, I guess, from time to time.
Mm.
But the Qing did take Taiwan, I guess, and controlled it then for over 200 years,
Yeah.
up until 1895 or so. Was that right? When it was ceded to Japan?
Yeah. So in 1894, a war breaks out between China and Japan. It doesn't have anything to do with Taiwan initially. The Qing China loses, and the part at the bargaining table, Japan wants Taiwan as its first colony. This is a Japan that 30 years before was really closed off pretty much to the rest of the world. The sort of Tokugawa regime had in Japan had kept things closed off. It was one of the most closed off societies in the world. And Japan kind of opens up, it flourishes, it takes power, and it starts honestly colonizing, smacking around its neighbors. China was one of the first to feel the fury of Imperial Japan. And that happened in 1895 when the Japanese said, look, you have to give us Taiwan as a part of our agreement to end the war. uh, China doesn't really want to do it, and they kind of sign it with their fingers crossed behind their backs. They try to basically encourage local Taiwanese officials to not accept Japanese rule. The Qing officials established what's called the Republic of Taiwan in 1895, and they're basically going to say, we're not going to accept Japanese rule. And the Qing is hoping that they will be able to come back and take control of the island, or maybe control of the island will pass to France or some other colonial empire, not the Japanese. But the Japanese just invade and really brutally put down any resistance. The Japanese were quite violent in 1895 as they took Taiwan. There's just outside of Taipei, there's a place where Taiwanese resistance fighters massacred some Japanese teachers, and for 6 weeks, the Japanese just scoured that region, killing pretty much everyone that they could.
And so the Japanese then controlled the island from, I believe, it was 1895 until 1945. And then, of course, the KMT, or Republic of China forces, moved to Taiwan when they lost the civil war against the communists.
Yeah. So the KMT so Japan hands over in 1945, and the KMT, along with U.S. troops, actually landed at about the same time on Taiwan, but in fairly small numbers. The KMT, ROC, the Republic of China government, takes over and starts running Taiwan, and there's a lot of friction there. It eventually explodes in 1947. There is a violent killing of a woman selling cigarettes, and the Taiwanese express frustration by basically killing, massacring Han Chinese, any people associated with the KMT or the ROC government, and any Han Chinese folks who've come from the mainland to Taiwan. And that is quickly put down in an incredibly brutal and violent pushback about 8 days later. So that's called the 228 incident. And by March 8th, it occurs on February 28th. March 8th, Chinese forces from mainland China come and just kill indiscriminately Taiwanese folks. Still very in the public memory of Taiwan, it's still a very important event, and it's one of the things that's made it really hard for the KMT to maintain its legitimacy. Even today, the KMT is the one of the two main parties in Taiwan, but there are always questions about 228. The KMT has since apologized for that, and the KMT of today is quite different from the KMT back then. It was a dictatorial power. Today, it still has some of that heritage, and some of the people who were in the KMT then, there's some aspects of that, but it's really, the KMT is very much a democratic party. But so 228 happens, and then everybody in Taiwan who's not from the mainland really hates the KMT after 1947. Pretty much everybody just despises them. And then, to make it all worse, the KMT and the ROC lose control of China to Mao, and they have to flee and rely on Taiwan as their only base. So they're really in this pickle. How do you survive on an island where everyone hates you? But if you go back to your homeland, it's run by communists who absolutely hate you and will kill you. And they struggled to kind of figure that out. They install this dictatorship that lasts for 3 decades. Is very much a kind of Cold War banana republic feel, especially by the last decades, as the 1970s, the 1980s are happening, and countries are opening up. They're getting freer, and the sort of Cold War dictatorships are becoming a thing of the past. Taiwan really doesn't change until it does, and then it shifts radically. It shifts to becoming what is today one of the freest places in Asia. I forget the ranking. There's some ranking system, but I think Taiwan is in the top field for both.
Yeah, I believe it's Asia's number one democracy. That's for sure. Sorry to interrupt you there, Lee. But I suppose it's interesting then that today, of course, we still have the PRC, or China, still claiming that Taiwan belongs to them. And all the history you went through there since we started talking is very interesting. But you still have China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi, our leading wolf warrior, as he's known. Recently, I think in just last December, he was having talks with German officials, and he came out with what he called 7 locks to counter what he termed provocations from Japan, and to emphasize that Taiwan independence violates international law and the post-World War II order. And among these 7 locks, he mentions things like the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Proclamation. And I wanted to ask you about these also in the context of the whole history of Taiwan and China's claim. Do you think that the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Proclamation give China any further claim on Taiwan?
So I'm not a legal expert, but my understanding is basically the Cairo Declaration is not law, so it doesn't have any applicability in legal circles. The things that Wang Yi lists are to a certain degree, I don't think they really apply legally. The one thing he doesn't list is the 1951 Treaty of San Francisco, which neither the PRC nor the ROC were invited to see Japan's official surrender. In that 1951 treaty, Japan said they renounce any claim to Taiwan and we give it back. But they didn't say who they gave it back to. And that's one of the real questions, is there's a legal question as to who actually does rightfully own Taiwan. I don't think the case is at all clear. Wang Yi, the 7 locks are actually pretty weak locks. The Cairo Declaration, the Potsdam Declaration, I don't know how much those have bite in terms of international law.
Yeah, and I think a similar point would could be made about this UN resolution 2758, which again China will say gives them a claim over Taiwan, but it doesn't even mention Taiwan. It just
It doesn't. Yeah.
it just kind of denotes the change of representation at the UN from the ROC to the PRC.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think this goes back to that what your friend Perry Link called CCP's most sleek deceptions. I think this is part of their modus operandi. But when the upshot of it all, I think, and in all the great detail you've shared in your book, is that China's claim on Taiwan is a big fat lie.
And I wouldn't say it's a big fat lie. I would say it's very unclear, who actually owns Taiwan. And I think that people like Wang Yi are going to push whatever works for their position, but I don't think that they should be trusted. The case that China is trying to make is fairly weak, and I think the real thing that should be emphasized is that the Taiwanese people really don't want to become part of the PRC. Yeah, I don't understand why this can't be decided democratically. Why would you want this island to become, it's independent now, de facto independent. Why would anyone want it to become part of China? Even the Chinese, I don't know what the point would be. You would have these people who really don't like being a part of this, and they would be incorporated, forced to become part of China. And I think it actually would not be great for the PRC as well. I mean, people, Wang Yi really wants this, and every Chinese person who I talk to, I'll have to say, every citizen of the PRC, not every, but most citizens of the PRC really want Taiwan back. They feel like it's a badge of dishonor and shame that they lost Taiwan, and they really want it back. But I don't think it would be better.
Maybe we could move on from Taiwan to another topic that's covered in your book, Lee, and that is China's economy. And of course, recently we heard in January of 2026 that China's announcement that it achieved its 2025 GDP growth target of about 5%, driven by a strong export performance despite a slowdown in the second half of the year. However, many analysts have noted that China has many challenges, including weak consumer confidence, declining property values, high youth unemployment, and so on. But despite this, there have been many economists and so-called experts who have proclaimed that China is the future, like Tom Orlick, who you referred to in your book. And Tom Orlick, of course, is the author of China, the Bubble That Never Pops. But you say that the problem with China's economy today is missing girls. It sounds like a very different take. So maybe you can tell us a little about what you mean by that.
Yeah, so the Chinese economy is struggling with a demographic challenge, and it's one that was, I don't want to say it was fully caused by the one child policy, but it was helped along by the one child policy. The one child policy was a policy that was implemented late 1970s, early 1980s that basically said China is growing way too fast. We don't need this many kids. And the reason we don't want this many kids is because it will actually make us poor. And this is something that Deng Xiaoping bought into. There's a rocket scientist who came up with these insane kind of calculations that have no basis in reality. And he said, if we don't stop China's population growth, we are going to become poor before we can become rich. So they ended up just aborting large numbers of fetuses. It was really horrible for women. Under Maoism, women actually did fairly well. I despise Maoism in a lot of ways, but I have to say that in terms of feminism, there are a lot of positive things you can say about Mao's China in terms of what it did for women. Once Mao died, you quickly have this reversion to mean where China goes back to being a misogynistic society. Women under the one child policy, oftentimes had their monthly cycles surveilled. You had their monthly cycles posted on the walls of these bureaucrats who are monitoring and making sure women weren't having babies. And the result was that it created a lot that China had a lot fewer children, which was the exact plan. That was what they were going for. But now Chinese bureaucrats are looking and going, wait a second, we need more children. So in the early 2010s, China was still enforcing this policy, this very brutal policy of only allowing people to have one child. And if they tried to have more than one child, if, for example, some women ran away to have their second child and went to other parts of the country, sometimes they would bulldoze their house to make them come back. They would kidnap relatives until the woman came back. It was really a very brutal policy, and all for, I don't want to say nothing, because it was actually much worse than nothing. It was an idiotic idea that's causing a demographic problem. The way it's affecting China's economy today is basically old people tend to save more and spend less. And it's really hard to shift to the consumer economy that China needs to shift to in order to sort of move out of this export-only economy to a service economy, which is something that Beijing says again and again it's going to try and do. But it's really hard to do that when so many people are older, and it's just not happening.
So with people not spending, I guess there's a risk then of deflation, isn't that that's the thing you hear a lot of economists talk about?
Yeah, and that's apparently what China is going through right now.
Mm-hmm. You also say, and when you talk about this Tom Orlick, that he argued that the reason for China's economy being so successful was because the government intervened so deeply. But you say the Chinese government meddled too much in economic matters, and that governments that run economies ruin economies.
Yeah, in the book, I look back at the three most important economic events in China's history. And there's the Han Dynasty. Emperor Wu takes over the economy in around 136 BC. There is another economic event, the Wang Anshi food fight, I think I call it, in the 1060s, 1070s, which tears apart China, where you have conservatives and liberals fighting over economic policy and how deep the government should intervene in the economy. And then you have, of course, Mao's Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s, really starting in 1958. All of those are marked by a couple of things. You have a Chinese government that is fairly liberal in the classical sense of liberal, not exactly the same thing, but basically the government is not running the economy, and it doesn't try to. And you have a government that allows for not exactly the same thing that we as modern folks today would call freedom of speech, but you have a relatively open environment where people, especially bureaucrats, can criticize the government. And then someone comes along, a dictatorial leader comes along, whether that be Han Wudi, the Han Emperor Wu, whether that be Wang Anshi, the Song Dynasty figure from 1069. He is when he starts his program, or Mao. They take over the government. They cut down on free speech, and it results in disaster. The Great Leap Forward is a great example of how this works. Mao opened up the spigots. He said, please criticize us. And then when people did criticize him, he got really mad. And he said, okay, we're going to throw those of y'all who criticized us in jail. And then he comes up with this other crackpot idea where he's going to move people around and try and promote agriculture in a new sort of a newfangled way. It doesn't work. And part of the reason you have this massive amount of death, it's the largest famine in human history. I think 36 million people died, 36 million people not born because women nutritionally, they didn't have the resources to have babies. I have some very gruesome passages in there where women have their uteruses falling out of them. This was a fairly common thing that happened during the late 1950s, early 1960s, because women just didn't have the resources to maintain their reproductive parts. They didn't have the food. I think the calorie count went down to 1,700 calories a day, which is well below everything but the poorest country today. You have these horrific things that happen, and it's basically because after the government, after Mao said through the people who criticized him in jail, no one in the government was willing to criticize Mao, and statisticians saw what was happening. They saw the problems that China was facing, but no one said anything because they didn't want to get thrown in jail because they knew that that's what happened just a year or two before. So I think that what you're seeing in China today is very concerning in terms of the economy.
But often, we hear about the Chinese Communist Party's social contract that they have with the people. It's kind of this contract that rests on the assumption that as long as they deliver prosperity and stability, they retain whatever it is, the consent to govern. Do you think that this is breaking? This is falling apart?
I don't know if it's falling apart yet. I question those numbers that you mentioned before, that 5% growth. There's a group in the US that studies it that said actually growth was about 2.5 to 3%. And from just talking to people who go back and forth between China, it seems like the economy is in the toilet. And whatever statistics say, people are feeling really, really bad. I don't know what that means for the future, but I think that if to have, and the promise that the CCP made after 1989 is, like you said, you stay out of government and we'll make you rich. If they're not making them rich anymore, I'm just not sure how. Something has to change, right? There has to be either a new contract or something. I don't think the CCP is at all weak. They're Gordon Chang and others have talked about the coming collapse of China. I don't see that. Yeah, I suppose it could happen, but I don't see that in the cards right now. But I think that the CCP is increasingly facing problems. The demographic problem is going to continue to drag on the Chinese economy. It's going to cause deflation. How do they get out of that? I don't know. And I think they're going to have to figure something out.
And any final thoughts?
We haven't had a chance to talk about Xinjiang, but I know listeners of your podcast have heard from folks talking about Xinjiang. The Xinjiang section is also really fascinating. I think it's one of the sections where, if you think I'm just writing this anti-China history that supports anyone who doesn't like the CCP, it's going to call in. I think it'll undercut that. I talk about the Uyghurs and their history in Xinjiang and the Han Chinese history in Xinjiang. What's fascinating is that the Uyghurs actually did not come to China, did not come to Xinjiang until after the Chinese came. The Uyghurs appear, they're Turks who speak a form of Turkish, and they appear first in the 6th century in Mongolia, and it's not until the 800s, 900s that they actually wind up in Xinjiang, and their story is really fascinating, and it's really complicated, and I think that story is also one that needs to be told more, the story of Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, and the Chinese in that region.
Okay, Lee. Well, I think your book, China's Backstory, is tremendously entertaining and an informative read for anyone interested in China. And I want to thank you for taking the time and sharing your insights with us here on the podcast.
Neil, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on.
That's Dr. Lee Moore, who's the author of the book, China's Backstory, The History Beijing Doesn't Want You to Read. My sincere thanks to Lee for taking the time to share his valuable insights with us on Perspectives with Neilo. If you'd like to purchase Lee's book, which is published by Unsung Voices Books, we've placed links in the episode description and on our blog site at pwneilo.com. We'd also love to hear your feedback on our discussion. What do you think of China's claim on Taiwan? And how can democracies around the world support the Taiwanese people's right to self-determination? Drop us a comment on our Perspectives with Neilo social media pages or whichever app you use to listen to the podcast. You can also contact us via our blog at pwneilo.com. And if you enjoy this episode and you don't want to miss any future episodes, don't forget to hit that subscribe or follow button. This is the best way to support us and really helps motivate us to keep producing content. But that's where we leave it for now. Thank you for listening, and until the next time, 再见.